Thank you for joining us today for Look Before You Speak. This is recorded in 2017, so this is a new season, and we're producing 12 programs this year. Today we're thrilled to have with us Shalene Valenzuela, and she's the director of the Clay Studio here in Missoula. I'm just thrilled to have her with us today because she's such a cultural treasure for Missoula, and the Clay Studio itself is such an important part of the fabric of Missoula. And she's going to talk about some of her favorite artists today and some of the work. And that's the idea of the program, is to create a dialogue about art that we appreciate and enjoy. So, Shalene, thank you so much for coming in today again.
Thank you for having
being part of this program.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Steve. Mm-hmm. It's always fun.
So you brought in how many artists today? 5
different artists. A lot of what I was trying to think about for this. Last time I came and visited you, we talked about artists that were connected to the Clay Studio Missoula in a certain way, one way or another, as current or past residents. And this time I just wanted to kind of touch on the theme of scratching beneath the surface, and really dealing with artists that there are a few ceramic artists in this, but I also wanted to explore different mediums, and twofold, just that theme, and also these are artists I've been connected with in different ways, either working with on different exhibitions or collaborating with in different ways.
That's really great. I think sometimes one of the reasons I really like that approach today is sometimes I think if you get locked into a media and you're identified with a particular media, you get locked into that, and you know, the world of art and the world of these ideas that we're talking about is pretty big.
Yeah.
So,
and a lot of the themes I deal with my work, I'm talking about all sorts of different subjects that aren't just in the context of the ceramic art world. So these artists explore themes to me that are important to me as well.
That's great. That's great.
The approach of like something beneath the surface of what you initially see when you first approach a work. It may be appealing in some ways. With me, I have certain graphic imagery that draws people in, and then they start seeing different narratives as they approach the object closer. So.
Yeah, I think that for those that haven't seen the program before, we usually put an image up, and then that is what's on the screen. Oftentimes people look at imagery, and television conditions us to look at imagery and scan it and produce it in our minds in less than 2 seconds. And so we're going to keep the images up for a little bit longer and talk about them. And so who'd you bring in first? Okay,
the first artist that I will be talking about today is John Zimmerman. He was actually a resident, short-term resident, the Clay Studio of Missoula, has been our resident, the Archie Brave Foundation, and he teaches in Gallup, New Mexico. And his work, there are these solid forms that have reference to geography. And not only that, he's using not only ceramic medium, but also involves different media, wood, metal in his sculptures. And so when you look at them, they just look like these solid, massive objects and have a clear reference to geography and the earth. But
that's solid right there?
It's not a solid form, but it's just like a solid, just as a form, as like sort of this sort of concept is this like looks like this solid mass. You initially approach it as this solid mass that has reference to geography. But the way that he creates these sculptures is like clay has this reference to earth, but then he's also using these things that are drawn from the earth and then introducing man-made sort of elements into it, certain glazes and frits and these like sort of colors that like are natural, but then unnatural in ways. And so it's like referencing about like how the earth has like evolved over the years and how these natural forms have also been influenced by sort of the touch of man.
Yeah, they're very painterly as well. I think it's one of those things about the mediums crossing, cross-referencing. So those are great images. Let's look at another artist.
The second artist that I brought in today is Courtney Blazon. So what I find very interesting, we have these very interesting dialogues about how people approach our works, where you'll initially, the thing that I have and she has in common is the fact people are like, oh, it's so cute or pretty or something like that. But then you like I was saying, the theme of scratching beneath the surface. This first piece is from her exhibition that she just had at the Missoula Art Museum, The Year Without a Summer, where she was referencing the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia that had effects around the world and basically caused all this sort of chaos, climate change and leading to cholera outbreaks and whatnot. And so this complex work, this one piece that was part of this whole complex show features all these different elements, and this is Le Fin du Monde, I believe, and basically this piece is exploring different things happening simultaneously and throughout the world as a result of that eruption, and introducing literary references in there with Lord Byron.
I think, when I see her work, I think of these are based in truth. They're really elaborated, and she's a great storyteller. And I think one of the things that came out in that exhibit is it's humans out of sight, out of mind. Easy to forget all of these things that she's bringing to our attention. And it's. I also think of Edvard Munch a little bit. Who said. Art is happy, art is sad, but art is mostly sad. And there's a lot of when superficially you look at these, and there's they feel like children's illustrations.
Exactly.
And then underneath the surface, you find these dark truths.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then so every time I feel like, especially in that exhibit, there is so much complexity to all the pieces. You could keep going back to the exhibit and find something new, within each of the drawings.
What's going on here in this?
Oh, this one. This is a drawing that is in reference. It looks like, just the setup of it with the floral arrangement around the border, and this is in reference to a. I'm trying to read the name of the piece, but it's in reference to she just picked up on this newspaper article about a young prostitute who tried to kill herself many times and then was unsuccessful at doing it. And then, and I think eventually she was successful, but she was basically this young prostitute ridiculed in Butte for this. And so it's this sort of sweet but dark image, and then you find the history behind it, and it's a very dark history behind it, and a very pained history, but then sort of this cherubic face of the girl, and I
also think it's I really enjoy seeing Courtney accomplish so much with drawing.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's great. So, okay, we're gonna
move on.
Yeah, let's move on.
This is a work by artist Chris Antiman. She is based in Joseph, Oregon. She actually had this piece, the Forbidden Fruit series. It's been touring in the United States right now, but it's a project that she created at Meissen, which is the factory that's produced porcelain objects in Germany for the past few hundred years. And so it has this rich history, and they've worked in collaboration with a few artists on creating works that are produced partially with using some molds that are in the Meissen vault. And then so what is really great about her work is she references these 18th century porcelain figurines. And then she's putting them in these like, sort of playful contexts where a lot of these scenes are dinner party scenes and scenes between 2 or 3 different figures. And there are these beautiful, lush, elaborately painted objects with floral imagery. It looks very appealing, but there's a lot of these different, like, sort of underlying dialogues between all the figures. And it's talking about power plays and femininity and masculinity and relationships. And so
when I look at this piece, and I haven't seen it in person, but I've seen some of her work in person, like at the Clay Studio. And I think of just the whole history of Judy Chicago, the dinner party, the comment on gender, and these are, you know, from the first look, they feel very superficial. You know, they feel flowery, and then you get into it and you realize that there's a lot of content.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, it's the same sort of thing that we were just talking about with Courtney's work, where it's so full and so rich of so much color and so much alluring detail. And then, so superficially, you'll look at it and go, oh, that's a pretty or cute or like sort of attractive thing. But then when you get drawn in deeper, and when you actually, as you said with the theme of this program, we're sitting here and talking about artwork and delving into it and taking the time to look a little deeper into it, you start seeing the different stories and just to start discovering more. And with that Forbidden Fruit series, I mean, it's such an elaborate production. There's so much going on there.
I think the content is strong, and I think formally they're really great. You know, they're all structurally really resolved when you walk up to them.
Yeah, and so there are these like little objects that pack this like this great punch. And
let's move to the next artist. You brought some dynamite people today.
This is Maggie Rosiecki Hiltner, and her work is actually, lives in Red Lodge, Montana. She works in textile-based forms, and she will actually be, I believe, exhibiting at the Missoula Art Museum this summer. I believe the show is opening in May. And so she takes these collections of, she'll find, it's found objects, so she finds some old embroidery from old thrift stores and whatnot, and also takes this collection of stuff and incorporates it and alters it, and then introduces her own stitched work to create these elaborate compositions that, like Chris and like Courtney, you have this elaborate thing that you see. It's this very colorful thing with this kitschy imagery that people will read as like, oh, this looks familiar, this references a certain thing. But then she talks about these different topics: environment, pressures on children, family, like sort of different, like her like it's not all happy. Like she's telling some stories in there. Yeah,
it relates to the Munch saying again, and that, you know, artists are inspired to do things because of the challenges that they perceive in the world, and they try to relate to what that story is, and how can I share that story.
Yeah.
You know, it's not all Mickey Mouse. And, you know, so.
Well, and then also this found imagery, we think of this nostalgia that's in that. And then I know Maggie has mentioned before where she finds the stuff and like there are these discarded like embroidery that she finds in stores that like these women have spent like countless amount of hours on and invested time in. And so she's like taking bits and pieces of that and creating a new life for it and a new dialogue and sort of like this reimagined history of like these connections between what these different objects are, and then bringing them into her own compositions and creating these sort of elaborate tales this one image that's up is just part of it. This is just a component of some larger complex piece that she made. And I just find just that image of this little girl just like sort of throwing up like that, sort of these flowers. It's just beautiful and twisted at the same time.
That's great. And I just really have always, from the first time I saw her work, enjoy her sensibility about color. And, you know, she's also changing the context of the work from it being a folk art piece and altering it into a way in which, and I kind of, you know, it changes it to artwork that's a little more elaborate and complex.
Yeah.
And I'm not demeaning folk art, but it comes from a different place.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like working, for me, working in clay, it's like seen as this craft-based medium. And then so you're always trying to defend, like, okay, how do you elevate this from just like, there's always that context of like, where does clay belong in the bigger capital A art world?
Well, and I think we live in a time now when a lot of those barriers between what was the academy and between and especially folk art are really blurred and broken down, and people do incorporate anonymous work into their work and have the freedom to do that, and that's part of the language of our time. So let's look at another artist. I hope.
Okay, this will be the last one. Okay. So yeah. So this is work. She's an emerging artist, and her name is Sarah Tancred. She finished her degree, her MFA at University of Montana a few years ago, and has gone on to work in a few different places. She's been in South Dakota. She's been in New Mexico just as visiting artist and lecturer positions, and then now I believe she lives in Minnesota and is visiting artist at North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota. And basically she works in porcelain, and she's referencing forms and forms that reference like post-World War II homemaking items. And a lot of this is in discussing the transitioning role of women in like transitioning in the workplace, and also being homemakers. And so that idea of these are actually Jell-O salad molds. And then so she's taking this sort of mundane object that references like the quick meal idea and making it into like this arrangement on the wall that sort of elevates the prestige of this like sort of cheap, quick, easy meal, and elevating that sort of notion of the woman's place. And
are those? I mean, they're very dark. Are those glazed?
Those are glazed, yeah.
Wow. And porcelain. So they're thin.
Yeah.
Wow. And they're, wow, that's really wild. I'd love to see this piece in person.
Yeah, so she's been working, it's great. She's been working with these groupings of these objects, and they're like kind of like these seemingly everyday objects, but then putting them in this different context where they have a relation, but then they're creating this beautiful landscape in a way, but they have a lot of meaning behind those objects.
Can we go back to that piece why did she choose to use such dark glaze? And is the glaze the same on each of the pieces, or is
there's a slight subtle differences between them all? And
what is that glaze?
You know, it's probably just I'm not sure exactly what glaze I couldn't tell you exactly what glaze it is, but it's sort of I believe that she's using it because it has reference to sort of because those Jell-O molds used to be made out of like metal, And so I think she's referencing the look of that. And then...
they look like chocolate. And yeah, I think that's really wonderful, that choice, and the use of multiples.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, it looks like this decorative piece, and then you start like learning the history behind it and what these objects were and how these molds were used to make these like sort of quick meals, because women were expected to like work outside of the home and then work in the home, and then sort of simplifying their lives, and so it's elevating this like object of simplification in their lives.
Yeah. And okay, and then let's look at the next piece of hers, but I hope we don't run out of time.
Yeah, it's this...
and these are porcelain as well.
These are porcelain, and it's a series of socks, porcelain cast socks that hang on the wall, and then it's a little dark on the screen, but the like dark spots on the socks are all gold luster parts, and so it's referencing darning of these socks. Oh. So it's like that idea of this like mending and taking so much, it's elevating, like, because that repair of socks, it's like you have the stitching, but then the gold luster is sort of like elevating that care that goes into each of the stitches, because you're like trying to patch together something to keep it going so that you don't have to buy more socks.
Sure, and I think oftentimes you know, all of those skills that we learn growing up from being very, very young, you know, we can go and see art that's far away, and but we also have to understand that a lot of those skills that we're nurtured with and given from very young occur in the home.
Yeah.
How many of these?
Oh goodness, I feel like there was like about 24 of these. I just saw this piece, she had it. There's a huge National Ceramics Conference every year, and this year it just happened in Portland, Oregon. And so I was in an exhibition that she put together, and she had this piece installed at Pacific Northwest College of Art, and they just hung on the line in the wall.
It's really great.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to see this in person.
Yeah.
And that's quite wonderful.
And it's like, you know, in the space, it's like a very quiet piece, but then like your eyes are drawn to those little specks of like gold luster on the wall. And it's like, you know, that idea of like just darning a sock. It's like there's so much time and investment in just like stitching this thing together, like keeping something together and paying homage to like that just sort of simple act of doing that to keep something practical going in one's life.
So there's you know, in all the artists that you brought in today, there seems to be some consistent themes in there. And how would you summarize that?
Well, like I said from the beginning, scratching the surface, where, you know, you approach all these objects are very objects and well, I'm saying objects, but it's like also the 2D and 3D pieces. They're all very alluring right away. They're all very attractive right away on the surface. There's something that draws you in, be it gold luster or the heaviness and colorful weight of something or something pretty in the piece. And so upon first glance, you may be drawn in for that reason. And then when you look a little closer or start thinking about it a little bit more, there's a story lying underneath there that has a lot more layers to it.
Yeah, and I think you know, when I look at these artists, there's you know, there's a little bit of obscurity, but there is definitely a content and definitely something the artist is trying to convey, a story the artist is trying to convey. You know, whether it has to do with land use or the land or gender or just different things, but the stories are consistent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for putting this all together. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about you know, the Clay Studio has a gallery, and recently it expanded and has become has a lot more space.
It does. It's like a real gallery instead of a hallway and like some strange old office with bars on the window that we sort of created as our exhibition space. But
so how has that changed related to the clay studio and programming?
Well, what has been really great about that is it gives our gallery more flexibility because there's two parts. There's basically two components to our gallery. We have our year-round sales gallery space where we represent different regional artists, our member artists, and current and past artists and residents. And then there's the exhibition space where we change out monthly exhibitions. Pretty much we have different rotating exhibitions 11 times a year. We take January off. And what's been great about it's like one huge space that's sort of divided up, and so we can adjust the size of the space according to the exhibition. So it's been really interesting sort of experimenting with that, smaller exhibitions. We had one in August with artist in residence who was finishing up her residency, Miriam Griffin, and she makes very small, detailed work, and so to have her work in this like sort of defined space would be really difficult and challenging for her because she'd have to produce like 100 pieces.
Some flexibility.
Yeah, so she's able to push in a wall and create this small, intimate space for people to explore in. Whereas somebody with larger works, I'm thinking about our current resident, Krista Ann Ames, who makes figurative sculpture and larger works, and she will be having a show there in September of this year, and I'm pretty sure she'll pull out and use most of the space. So it gives a lot more flexibility to the vision of the artist who's using the space.
You actually host different types of exhibitions. They're both invitational, but you also guaranteed the residents an exhibition before they leave.
Yes.
So that's the mix.
Yeah.
And so how many exhibits per year are you talking about?
We're talking about 11, and we have our fixed exhibits for this month. We have our Pot Sketch as our fundraiser, and it happens in April, and so we have our Pot Sketch preview exhibition in there. So we always have certain exhibitions that are fixed. In December, we always have our holiday sale. So there's certain things that just happen every year, and then the programming varies, and then we'll have different guest artists. We're really excited in May. We're going to be having Doug Baldwin, a retrospective of his work, and he will be creating some newer works for those shows and have some tricks up his sleeve. So we're very much looking forward to that.
And I imagine that will include some animation.
Well, yes.
Probably.
Yes, he has something in the works. So.
Okay. Well, I wanted to just wrap this up, but I wanted to thank Shalene for coming on, and Shalene has most humbly come on and talked about other artists, and she hasn't really talked about the fact that she is a gifted artist herself. And the Clay Studio has quite a history of having directors and staff members there who show up and produce work themselves, and I think that that's a really important characteristic of the institution. Any of you who've not been out and seen the Clay Studio or visited the Clay Studio or gone and appreciated the work that the Clay Studio has brought to our community, I encourage you to go out. And you're open later on First Fridays.
Yes, we are open from 5:30 to 9.
So I wanted to thank Shalene for coming on today and the thematic discussion, and please tune in next week for Look Before You Speak. Thank you very, very, very much.